I think royal duty is extremely important. I think it's part of the fabric of what the royal family and any.
Things aren't as perfect as they seem behind palace walls. At a recent charity event at Windsor Castle, Prince William brushed off Queen Camilla in front of everyone. It wasn't loud or dramatic, but it was cold enough to leave her visibly upset. Guests didn't know where to look. So, what's going on between William and his stepmother? And will this finally push King Charles into choosing between the two people closest to him? Join us as we uncover what William said that left Camilla in tears. Forbidden guest list. The chandeliers in Windsor Castle sparkled as important people from all over Britain walked through the doors. Outside, cameras flashed while fancy cars dropped off guests dressed in beautiful gowns and sharp suits. It looked like a regular royal event, but for Queen Camilla, this night was special. It was supposed to be her big moment. But behind the castle's old stone walls, something was going wrong. Something that would change the way people saw the royal family. People who work in the palace say the trouble started weeks before the party. Queen Camilla had asked the event planners for a simple favor. She wanted her oldest son, Tom Parker Bowles, to come to the event. Tom is a food writer and has been to many family gatherings before. Camilla thought this was a small and normal request. What she didn't know was that Prince William had noticed, and he wasn't happy. William, who will one day be king, had been paying close attention to Camilla. He saw how she was starting to do things her own way. She wasn't just being queen consort, she was changing how the role worked. For William, the guest list was the final straw. People who know royal rules say these events follow strict traditions. Close family members of the king or queen usually get invited. Spouses come too. But Tom wasn't part of the royal bloodline. He was the queen's son from before she married King Charles. If he got invited, it could change how things worked for future events. William didn't want that. Inside the palace, Camilla tried to explain. She talked about Tom's work, his love for the family, and how he always stayed out of the spotlight. She hoped the others would understand. But William said no. No changes, no deals. Tom was not allowed to come. But Camilla didn't give up. She talked to friends in the palace. She spoke to King Charles in private. She even suggested Tom could attend quietly without any attention. But every idea was turned down. William stood firm. The night of the event came. Guests arrived and had their names checked. Everything looked perfect. Cameras flashed. Smiles were everywhere until Tom Parker Bowles showed up. The guards, following orders, politely told him he couldn't come in. Tom, who came to support his mother, had to stand outside while others walked past him. It was both a public and painful moment. Inside, Camilla noticed right away. She tried to smile for the cameras, but people could tell she was upset. She had worked hard for years to become part of this family. But now, her own son wasn't welcome. William made his message clear that he was in charge now. He decided who was allowed and who wasn't. Camilla could wear the crown, but she couldn't change the rules. The party went on. People ate and drank, listened to music, and gave speeches. Everything looked normal, but behind the scenes, everyone could feel it. Things had changed. William had made his first big move, and he won. Experts say this was a big moment for the royal family. It showed that the younger generation was starting to take control. William wasn't just following old rules, he was setting new ones for the future. As the party ended and the guests left, Camilla stayed strong. She smiled, waved, and thanked everyone, but the people close to her could see the sadness behind her smile. This guest list was her first real loss as queen consort. And it might only be the beginning. William's plans were just getting started, and they could affect Camilla's family even more in the future. What set his calculated revenge in motion? Coronation conspiracy. The seeds of this royal conflict were sown on May 6, 2023, a day that should have marked the most triumphant chapter in Camilla's life. Westminster Abbey pulsed with anticipation as 2,000 distinguished guests assembled for the coronation of King Charles. The ancient ceremony, which for nearly a millennium had crowned British monarchs, was now preparing to bestow upon Camilla the title of Queen Consort. Yet beneath the gilded pageantry, a quiet betrayal was unfolding, one that would send ripples through the heart of the monarchy. According to palace sources, Camilla had been granted considerable control over the coronation guest list. This, in itself, wasn't unusual. Royal consorts traditionally invite close family and personal friends to witness their moment of ascension. Camilla's choices, however, sent chills through the entire royal establishment. She extended invitations to 20 members of her inner circle. Her son, Tom Parker Bowles, was given a prime seat. Her daughter, Laura Lopes, received a place of honor. Friends from her life before royalty were ushered into one of Britain's most sacred spaces. For a woman once seen as an outsider, the symbolism was striking. She now had the authority to determine who belonged at the monarchy's most consequential event. But the real controversy wasn't about who got in, it was about who didn't. Insiders described the final guest list as an act of stunning disregard. Key figures who had worked for years to rehabilitate Camilla's public image were nowhere to be seen. Politicians who had defended her during her most polarizing years watched the ceremony from afar. Journalists and editors, those who had helped reframe her narrative from royal interloper to respected matriarch, were left off entirely. Even palace aides who had guided her transition into royal life were quietly excluded. Knowingly or unintentionally, she had signaled that now that Camilla had reached the summit, she had no use for those who helped her ascend. Prince William and Princess Catherine took notice. For years, they had navigated the delicate machinery of public relations with caution, understanding that institutional success required loyalty, inclusion, and long memory. Watching Camilla discard those values in favor of personal loyalty struck them as both short-sighted and dangerous. The damage became visible during the coronation itself. As Charles processed down the Abbey aisle, newly crowned and carrying the weight of history, every head bowed in deference. The moment was steeped in tradition, a kingdom pausing to honor its sovereign. Then came Camilla, adorned in Queen Mary's crown and trailing a velvet robe. But this time, the atmosphere shifted. The congregation, composed of global dignitaries, senior politicians, and elite Britons, remained motionless. Not a single person bowed. The silence hung in the air, captured on live broadcast, and replayed endlessly in the days that followed. For royal watchers and protocol experts alike, it was an unprecedented moment. In modern history, no queen consort had ever received such a public, unified snub. In that brief pause, a message echoed through Westminster Abbey. Camilla may wear the crown, but she had not earned the room. Princess Catherine, seated front and center, maintained a composed, unreadable expression. She offered no smile, no nod of acknowledgement, no subtle gesture of solidarity. For a woman known for her poise and diplomacy, the absence of even a hint of support spoke volumes. Even Prince Harry, estranged though he was, appeared visibly uncomfortable. Insiders say he was dismayed by the scene, unable to intervene as his stepmother endured a very public humiliation. In the days that followed, palace staff scrambled into damage control mode. Press officers worked late into the night, minimizing media coverage of the congregation's cold reception. Official photographs were carefully curated to spotlight Charles alone, avoiding wide angles that might reveal the stillness of the crowd as Camilla passed. But for William, the moment had already solidified a deeper truth. The guest list wasn't just a misstep in judgment, it was a sign of things to come. Camilla's approach to power was now obvious to all. Reward personal loyalty, ignore tradition, and reshape the monarchy in her own image. He responded in kind. If Camilla could exclude those who mattered to the institution, then William would exclude those who mattered to her. The Windsor Charity Gala would be his proving ground, and Tom Parker Bowles, once seated proudly at his mother's coronation, would become the first name struck from the list. The coronation may have crowned a king and queen, but it also exposed a fissure within the House of Windsor. The consequences of that day were only just beginning to surface. While William made his move in plain view, what was Camilla's private reaction behind closed doors? The Queen's breaking point. The moment Tom Parker Bowles was turned away from Windsor Castle, something within Queen Camilla quietly fractured. Palace staff who had known her for years described a woman they barely recognized in the hours that followed. The steady, composed figure who had endured decades of scandal and public judgment now found herself facing a kind of pain she hadn't anticipated. and couldn't disguise. According to royal sources, Camilla learned of her son's rejection while she was still mingling with guests inside the castle. A discreet aide delivered the news in a whisper during a brief pause between photographs. Her face went pale, but she didn't flinch. Cameras were rolling. Dignitaries were watching. There was no space for reaction. The role demanded endurance, and she gave it. For the next 3 hours, Camilla performed with the same precision that had defined her public persona. She smiled on cue, exchanged pleasantries with donors, and delivered her remarks on charitable causes without a misstep. But those closest to her saw the strain. They noticed the faint tremor in her hand when she reached for her wine glass. They saw how often she glanced toward the entrance, as though hoping her son might still arrive. It wasn't until the ride back to Clarence House that the facade finally crumbled. Insiders recall a woman who had held herself together with steel resolve, suddenly breaking under the emotional weight of the evening. First came the tears, then something deeper, a quiet reckoning with the reality of her own limitations. Camilla had weathered rejection before. She had lived through years of public hostility following Diana's death, endured countless comparisons to the late princess, and spent decades methodically rebuilding her image. One patronage, one appearance, one act of humility at a time. But those battles were fought in newspapers and tabloids. This one came from within the very walls she believed had finally accepted her, and that made it personal. The humiliation wasn't just public, it was private, and the impact cut to the core. Camilla had spent much of her royal life shielding her children from palace politics. She kept Tom and Laura out of the spotlight, protecting them from the institution's unforgiving glare. They built careers outside the royal bubble, lives of their own, distinct from their mother's complex role in the monarchy. But with a single gesture, Prince William had shattered that boundary. Her son was no longer just family, he had become a pawn, and it became clearer that no one in her orbit was safe from the games of power. The following morning, staff found Camilla sitting alone in her private sitting room, gazing silently at old family photographs. She had long drawn strength from her identity as a mother and grandmother, a role that grounded her amid the formality of royal life. Now that sense of protection felt hollow. She had failed to shield her child from disgrace, and that truth weighed heavier than any title. The emotional toll was subtle, but unmistakable. Observers noted the change. Camilla's posture, usually upright and commanding, had softened. Her smiles took longer to form. In photographs, there was a visible shift. The queen consort no longer appeared untouchable. She looked human and hurt. Behind the scenes, she tried to repair the damage. Sources say she quietly requested private meetings with William, hoping to diffuse the tension. Each request was declined, always politely, always through intermediaries. The prince, they were told, was preoccupied with official engagements. Those close to the situation began to see the pattern. This wasn't just a reaction to the coronation guest list, it was a recalibration of power. William wasn't simply drawing boundaries, he was redrawing the monarchy's internal map. Camilla could wear the crown, she could fulfill the duties, but she would no longer shape the terms. Perhaps the deepest wound came not from William, but from Charles. Though the king privately comforted his wife, he remained publicly silent. He issued no statements of support, made no gesture to challenge his son's authority. Caught between his queen and his heir, Charles chose caution, and in doing so, he left Camilla alone to weather the storm. Historians may someday mark this chapter as a turning point, not just for Camilla, but for the evolving power dynamics of the modern monarchy. She had risen to the top of Britain's most exclusive institution, only to discover that the summit came with constraints she had not foreseen. The crown she had fought so long to wear came at a price she was only beginning to grasp. But William's quiet war was far from over, and the next blow would strike even closer to home. What monetary loss could pierce the queen consort's composure and leave her visibly shaken? Financial fallout. The tears streaming down Queen Camilla's face weren't just about her son Tom's public humiliation at Windsor Castle. They stemmed from something deeper, an unfolding realization that her family's ties to the monarchy were being severed, one decision at a time. For nearly 2 decades, Camilla's younger sister, Annabel Elliot, had held a role that most interior designers could only dream of. Thanks to her royal connection, she had been entrusted with the redesign and refurbishment of properties across the Duchy of Cornwall, holiday cottages in Cornwall, grand estates in Wales, and historic homes in the Isles of Scilly. Her work became synonymous with understated royal luxury. The compensation was generous. In her final year working under King Charles, Annabel reportedly received £25,000 in design fees alone. That didn't include the substantial budgets she managed, over £115,000 in furnishings and supplies during a single year. For 20 years, her work was a fixture in duchy operations, and payments flowed regularly from its accounts into hers. That all changed when Prince William assumed control of the duchy. According to the duchy's 2024 annual report, Annabel Elliot received no payments. After 2 decades of steady engagement, her name was nowhere to be found in the ledgers. Quietly and without ceremony, the professional arrangement had come to an end. Palace sources say the explanation offered behind closed doors was that the duchy team had learned enough from Annabel's tenure. Her services were no longer needed. The reasoning, couched in terms of modernization and internal development, rang hollow to those familiar with the inner workings of royal protocol. To insiders, the move felt unmistakably personal. The financial cost was minimal for a portfolio as profitable as the Duchy of Cornwall. What mattered more was the symbolism. For those paying attention, it was another unmistakable sign that William was distancing the crown from Camilla's family. The timing made the shift especially painful. Just months earlier, Annabel had stood at Camilla's side during the coronation, robed in tradition and photographed as a visible part of the royal circle. Their sisterly bond had been celebrated publicly, from Westminster Abbey to the royal box at Wimbledon. That image of acceptance, belonging, and enduring closeness had seemed secure. Now that image was crumbling. Those within the palace described Camilla's reaction as deeply emotional. Her distress was not only for her sister's lost livelihood, but for the broader implications. Each contract that disappeared, each name left off a guest list, each role quietly dissolved. It all pointed to a future where her family's place in royal life was shrinking. To some observers, William's moves appeared strategic. Tom Parker Bowles' exclusion from royal events, Annabel's quiet departure from duchy affairs. These weren't isolated incidents. They were steps in a deliberate restructuring of the monarchy's inner circle. It stood in stark contrast to King Charles's approach. During his tenure, he had drawn Camilla's family closer, sharing opportunities and roles with those who had supported him. William, by comparison, seemed intent on drawing firmer boundaries, ones that left little room for Camilla's extended family. For Camilla, the shift was hard to ignore. Annabel's decades of service had ended without recognition. Her expertise, once highly valued, had been dismissed with a stroke of a pen. The financial loss was real, but it was the message behind it that hurt more. Still, those close to the Queen Consort say the setback, while painful, is unlikely to define her. After all, Camilla had withstood years of intense scrutiny, public backlash, and personal loss. She had rebuilt her image and earned her place in the institution through perseverance and restraint. If William believed financial pressure would silence her or dim her resolve, he may have miscalculated. The Queen Consort has endured worse, and she may yet prove that her influence, though under siege, is not so easily erased. In all of this, one man held the power to end this war. Would King Charles choose his wife or his heir? The king's intervention. When reports reached King Charles about his wife's tears and his son's ruthless financial decisions, the newly crowned monarch found himself cornered between the two people most vital to the future of his reign. What began as a private family rift had spiraled into a full-blown crisis, one that now threatened the very stability of the monarchy itself. Charles had spent a lifetime preparing to wear the crown, yet nothing in decades of royal duty had prepared him for this moment. On one side was Camilla, his steadfast partner, now questioning her place in the institution she had fought for decades to join. On the other was William, his son and heir, unwavering in his conviction that preserving the monarchy meant reshaping it, even if that meant dismantling what Charles and Camilla had built together. The king acted quickly. Within 48 hours of the Windsor Charity Gala fiasco, Charles summoned both William and Camilla to his private study at Clarence House. This wasn't a family catch-up over afternoon tea. It was an emergency summit, a last-ditch effort to contain a crisis that risked unraveling the carefully crafted image of royal unity. Palace aides described the atmosphere as taut with unspoken conflict. Charles, long known for his measured approach and preference for dialogue over confrontation, now found himself mediating between two resolute forces. William arrived with the poise of a man certain he was defending the crown. Camilla entered with the quiet pain of someone who had sacrificed personal dignity for public duty, only to see her family's position strategically erased. The meeting lasted over 3 tense hours, far longer than anyone had expected. Behind those locked doors, Charles turned to the tools of diplomacy that had defined his public life. He acknowledged William's concerns about modernizing and streamlining the monarchy, but he also validated Camilla's hurt, her sister cut from royal accounts, her son publicly slighted. Both of them, he reminded gently but firmly, were now pillars of an institution that could not afford to fracture. The monarchy, Charles emphasized, could not survive on tradition alone, nor could it be guided solely by personal grievances. Its strength, especially in the modern era, depended on unity, not necessarily emotional unity, but visual and operational coherence. If the public began to sense a divided house, the institution would suffer in ways no one could predict. Charles didn't take sides. He didn't need to. His strategy was to reframe the conflict not as a family dispute, but as a shared responsibility. The coronation had placed him at the helm of one of the world's oldest institutions, but it had also made William his future and Camilla his present. Their fates were now intertwined, whether they liked it or not. What followed was a carefully managed display of unity. Within days, photos of Camilla and William appearing side by side at public engagements began to circulate. They shook hands with donors, exchanged polite words, even shared light smiles, each moment calibrated for maximum reassurance. The message was unmistakable. The royal family was solid, focused, and working in harmony. But palace insiders weren't fooled. The reconciliation was cosmetic, not emotional. Behind the carefully staged optics, the relationship between William and Camilla remained strained and brittle. She understood, at last, the limits of her influence. He understood the power of subtlety, continuing to phase out her family's involvement, not with bold moves, but with quiet decisions made behind palace walls. Still, Charles had achieved what he needed. The crisis had been contained. The royal brand remained intact, but in doing so, he had ushered in a new internal arrangement, one more political than personal. The Windsor family now functioned more like a coalition government than a close-knit household. Peace was maintained not by resolution, but by choreography. Royal watchers began noting the historical echoes. Queen Elizabeth II had navigated her own internal storms, her children's divorces, Margaret's rebellion, even the early tremors of the Diana years. But those had been either personal or reputational. This was something else. This was a strategic power struggle playing out not in the tabloids, but in boardrooms, budgets, and invitations. Charles had managed to paper over the cracks, but the foundation beneath remained under strain. And as the monarchy moved forward into a new era, one question loomed over every balcony wave, every press release, every family photograph. Could the fractured bond between this stepmother and stepson ever truly mend? What happens when a king's crown pulls him one way, but his blood pulls him another? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.